Welcome to another Restored Church podcast.
And we are in the middle of our new series called Impostor. And in this series, we're walking through the book of the two verses in Galatians that talk about the fruits of the Spirit. And this idea of the impostor, I think, sometimes can be overwhelming. You know, we always focus a lot of times on either the really great aspects of the fruits of the Spirit or the opposite end of the spectrum. Sometimes we miss that idea of what does that almost look like? What does the imposter look like? Because the imposter can sometimes look like it's almost there. And so if you've missed any of the first few weeks of our message, I ask that you go back and listen to the ones that you've missed. You can go onto our website, or you can go on to maybe if you have an Apple phone, download the message there, or you can download our app and listen on that as well. Or if you have an Android phone, you can figure out how to get it on there. I haven't had Android for a number of years, so I don't know how to listen to podcasts on there anymore, right? I don't know. I love Android. Don't worry, I used to have it. I got forced into an Apple. I don't know how it happened, but but I have it now. So, but it's going to be, if you read the verses in Galatians, it has the words there that we are supposed to live by, right? These must be kind of what is kind of a fruit of our life with Jesus. And I was supposed to preach in next month, but Dylan had to leave because there was his sister-in-law, Aubrey's sister, had a baby, and so they wanted to go visit and see the baby. And so actually he pulled the right-hander out of the bullpen, and gentleness gets brought up from the end of Scripture, end of the verses, all the way to the middle. So, you know, I know supposedly gentleness needs to be spoken on today, I guess. I don't know. But here's what we're talking about today. The fruits of the Spirit are 9 markers of any healthy relationship. As with anything great, there are numerous knockoffs, fakes, and imposters that seek to deceive us. During our series, we will dig into the real and dispense the imposters that cripple our relationships. So gentleness. Gentleness, to me, is something that you can see and experience when it walks into a room, right? You probably have met somebody that exudes gentleness, that exudes this characteristic in their life, and when they walk into a room, when they make their presence known, you know they're there. You know what it's like to have that person in your life. You know what it's like to have that person interacting with you on a daily basis. So gentleness. And here's what it says in Galatians. The fruits of the Spirit are, hold on, there we go. But the Holy Spirit produces this kind of fruit in our lives: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. And so here we are with gentleness, right? And I want to look at a couple of passages today, and I want to first look at 1 Kings chapter 19. 1 Kings 19. And if you have your Bible or your phone, you can pull it up. And in 1 Kings 19, Elijah is on the run for his life. Now, I'm not sure if you've been on the run for your life before. I have not. It's felt like that sometimes when I'm around my family. I have to run away. Sarah has texted me before when I'm on my way home from work. I'm done being a mom, so you better get home quickly. The boys are on the deck swinging, on the deck playing, and I'm done momming today, so you better get home quickly. So I don't think she was actually on the run for her life, but she probably felt like that sometimes in those moments. So Elijah has just ended a showdown, like this big confrontation with the prophets of Baal. And God was victorious, and God came down in fire and consumed the altar. He consumed the sacrifice on the altar. He consumed the wood on the altar. He consumed the rock and the water. Everything that was in the area of the altar, it was consumed by the fire. And so they then went in and destroyed and slaughtered most of the prophets of Baal. And now Jezebel has heard about what's going on. And so now she comes up and says, all right, Elijah, you killed my people. I'm coming after you. And says, you can run all you want, but I'm going to find you. When I find you, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to destroy you. So Elijah, with his quick thinking, runs. And he runs and he runs and he runs, and he's got his servant with him, and they keep running. And they're running and running. And finally, they got to a point where Elisha asked his servant, you got to stay here. I got to go on my own. Don't come with me. I got to go. So he runs and he runs and he goes. Can you imagine the burden he was carrying? Can you imagine how heavy that was in those moments? Knowing that he wasn't just running to get exercise, he was running for his life. And as he's running, it probably felt like he had a 50-pound pack on his back as he's going away from everything he knows, everyone he knows. And as he finally gets to the end of himself, he finally gets to this tree, and he collapses under the weight of this burden. He collapses under the weight of this impending death. And he lays down by this tree, and he says to himself, he says to God, okay, I'm done. It's enough. Will you let me die? Will you please kill me? I want to be like my ancestors. Just end my life now. I don't want to be running anymore from this. Will you end my life now? And so as he's laying under the tree, he falls asleep. And an angel comes and wakes him up. And it says, you need to eat. And so there's some hot coals there and some bread cooking. And he takes it and eats it and drinks the water. And he falls asleep again. And he sleeps a little bit longer, and the angel comes and wakes him another time, and he says, eat again, and then you need to go. So he eats the food, and he takes off running. He says, I'm going to show you where to go. So he runs for 40 days and 40 nights, running for his life. What are you running from today? See, some of us are running from who we have been. Some of us are running from what we are. Some of us are running because we don't know why we're running, but we're running away from something. So finally, after 40 days and 40 nights of running, he comes to this mountain, he comes to this place, and there's a cave, and he goes up and lays down in the cave and falls asleep. I can imagine he was exhausted after running and trying to get away from Jezebel, not wanting to die. He goes up there and he sleeps. And as he falls asleep, he's woken again, but this time the Lord comes to him and says, you need to wake up, and I want you to go to the edge of the cliff. And I'm going to come and see you. And here's what happens. He says, go out and stand before me on the mountain, the Lord said to him. And Elijah stood there, and the Lord passed by, and a mighty wind hit the mountain, and such a terrible blast, the rocks were torn loose. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there was a sound of a gentle whisper. And see, in that moment, that's where the Lord was. Exhausted, running for his life. You see, the impostor wants to call you out. The impostor of gentleness wants to call you out of where you're at. It calls us out because the impostor wants you to focus on the moment. The impostor uses the moments that we're in to call us out and take away from us rather than give us what we need. See, gentleness, led by the Holy Spirit, calls us in. See, when the Holy Spirit calls us, he calls us into something. He calls us into a moment. And as Elijah is standing on the mountain, as he's waiting for the Lord to come and speak with him, there's an earthquake and a windstorm and a firestorm and all those things. God could have called him out and said, why don't you trust me? He could have called him out and said, why do you not trust who I am? Am I not good enough to save you from Jezebel? Why are you running from this? But that's not what the Lord does. He waits for a moment to call him in. See, the imposter focuses on the moment rather than the promise. See, the promise was, I am here to save you and protect you and keep you where you're at. See, the Lord calls him with a gentle whisper. Because you see, when someone's yelling at us and screaming at us and trying to get our attention that way, we lean away from it, right? When my boys are not listening and they're kind of doing their own thing, and I've asked them 5 times to get dressed. Now, your kids would not ever do that, but mine do. They lean away from me, right? I'm like, you guys, I've told you something. And they lean away from me like, Dad, all you have to do is come tap us on the shoulder, right? That's my oldest son's new thing now. Dad, just come tap me on the shoulder and I'll do whatever you want. So I've tried doing that now. I've tried going over and going, remember you told me to tap you on the shoulder. You see, when there's this moment of this shouting and yelling, we lean away from it. But in the moment with a whisper, we get to lean in. Because we have to hear what he's going to say. So in the whisper, when God calls Elisha, when he calls into him, when he whispers to him, he gets to lean into who God is. You see, it's interesting that he uses the whisper because it talks about in Genesis how he breathed life into Adam. He didn't shout life into Adam. He whispered his life into Adam. And so God, see, the gentleness, true gentleness is a whisper into our life. Elijah needed something more than anything else. He needed somebody to revive him. And he's been running and running and running, doing all these things, carrying this burden of his life, a burden of his past, burden of this person trying to kill him. And he calls Elijah into gentleness. And see, it's odd because I would have expected God to do that, when he first started running. Or maybe when he sat down at the tree. See, God wanted him to be at the end so he can provide a new beginning. Because how many of us, we're going and going and going until we hit the end of that, we don't allow God to create a new beginning in our lives. Who to you, if you were going to just think back in your life, showed gentleness or shows gentleness? Maybe it's a friend, a family member, maybe it's somebody you saw on TV or a TV character, somebody like that. So just think for a moment, gentleness. Whose gentleness? Who exudes gentleness in your life? Not many of my friends, because as a Vikings fan, they like to terrorize me. But true, authentic gentleness. The first person that came to my mind as I was processing this was a TV personality, Mr. Rogers. Is there anybody more gentle and more kind than Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers was a person that as a child I watched his show. Mr. Rogers is a person that invited you into his home, but he also came into your space where you were at, right? And I am not sure why I was not more terrified of him, because if you remember the dolls that they used to use on his show were just very creepy and very weird. It was just, as a child, I should have been more afraid. And over the past few years, there's been a documentary that came out on the life of Mr. Rogers, and it talked about him as a person and what it was like to work with him. And then just this last week or two, a movie trailer came out. They're actually going to have another movie on him based on an event of this guy writing a story on Mr. Rogers. And this picture we have on the screen is actually from 1969. And this moment in TV history of Mr. Rogers, he was talking to his neighbors that were watching his show. And as he was talking to them, he said, "Oh boy, it's a hot day out today. I'm going to get the pool out." And so he puts his kiddie pool out, and I'm going to take my socks and shoes off. And he takes his socks and shoes off, and he starts filling the pool with the hose and washing his feet to cool down. And the police officer in the neighborhood stopped by, and he invited him. He said, it's a hot day. Would you want to put your feet in my pool? So he takes his socks and shoes off too, and they get in the pool together. Now, in 1969, this was kind of controversial because there was still segregation of pools and places, and they did not allow this to happen. So here is Mr. Rogers speaking into the lives of children all over the country, showing a moment of gentleness and grace, and says, "This is who I am. This is who we are." In this moment, he breaks down the barriers, breaks down the walls, and says, "This is what we are." In this gentleness, he shows who Jesus is. And now, this picture doesn't show it all, but at the end of this moment, as they're getting out of the pool, Mr. Rogers takes his towel and dries his feet off, and Officer Clemens says, "Oh, I don't have a towel." And Mr. Rogers says, "Well, you can use mine." And he actually takes Officer Clement's feet and dries them for him. In this washing act, like Jesus washed the disciples' feet, he takes this moment of gentleness, of grace, and he calls him into his life and says, "I'm going to dry and wash your feet." Flash forward to 1993, one of the very last episodes of the show. This happened again. He invites Officer Clemens back for one more time, and they sit in the pool together, and they take a moment to tell each other how much they love each other and how much this moment and this time has meant to each other. And Officer Clemens, his name is Francois, he shared in the documentary that he asked Mr. Rogers, "Do you really want to do this?" And he asked the producers on the show, "Is this an accident? Did he accidentally put this together, just happen to be here?" He says, "Mr. Rogers never, ever did anything on the show accidentally. Everything was on purpose." You see, so in this moment, he looked at Officer Clemens and says, "I love you. You are my neighbor." And he called him into this justice. He called him into this moment because, well, the impostor of gentleness calls you out. True gentleness calls you into something, into a space with us. And the beauty of gentleness is that we get to provide a posture that those that need it the most. See, those that needed it the most, those that needed gentleness the most in that time frame needed to see this posture, needed to see this moment. John chapter 4. John chapter 4 is a passage where Jesus goes to get a drink of water. And as he's getting a drink of water, this lady comes out, and he asks her, "Will you please give me a drink of water?" And there's this interaction between the two of them as they're kind of sharing this moment. And as they're sharing this moment, she says, I shouldn't be the one to give you a drink of water. And he says, "Well, where's your husband?" And she says, I don't have a husband. He says, "You're right. You're absolutely right. You don't have a husband. You have 5. And the person you're with right now is not your husband." Now, I wonder what the posture of Jesus was at that moment. I wonder what his voice was like. I wonder what his eyes were like at that moment. I have to believe, knowing who Jesus is, there had to be something in his eyes that just shone gentleness. And in a moment when he could have called her out, in a moment when he could have called her out and he could have boasted himself up for who he was, he didn't do that. He spoke into her life and spoke into her and said, "I have water for you, water that you'll never go thirsty ever again." See, Jesus placed himself into this person's life. The impostor of gentleness is about themselves. It's self-concerning. So the impostor of gentleness wants to make it about them in those moments, right? The impostor of gentleness will make it about themselves and who they are and what they can do for you. They almost talk about themselves. They talk about who they are, what they can do. They use their strength and power to overpower someone. In this interaction with Jesus, he's very frontal in a conversation. He's very truthful in who he is and what he has to offer. But he provides absolute gentleness in a moment that he didn't have to. You see, the imposter, that close enough, that good enough, is strength misplaced. See, Jesus could have used his power and his strength to overpower her and to tell her everything she's done wrong and say, "You are not good enough for me, but if you do enough things right, maybe I'll let you back in. If you do enough things, maybe you can come back with me and I can give you the water you need." This can be when we talk to our kids, our spouses, our friends, our coworkers. Do we overpower the moment? Do we overpower them and take them and bring them down a notch? Is it about us in those moments? If we've been given the strength we have, if we've been given strength from God to produce this gentleness. See, gentleness is using our strength to help those in need, to empower people that need it the most, right? Gentleness isn't about overpowering somebody and telling somebody, I am better than you, and I'm going to tell you how I'm better than you. Gentleness is empowering, is using our strength and our abilities to empower them for something better, something greater. So while it feels frontal, while the words of Jesus feel frontal and kind of right there for her, he empowers her and says, I have something better for you. You want to give me water here from this well? I have water where you will thirst never again. Imagine that. There's a show that I watched it's in college, and it's called Smallville. I don't know if you've ever heard of Smallville. It's a show basically chronicling Clark Kent growing up as a teenager. And as a teenager, he is already, most teenagers, no offense to those in you here, you're already awkward. I was the most awkward of all of you, so I can say that. I was a very awkward teenager, and you have these new abilities and powers, right, as a teenager. Now, imagine if that was magnified by 10, 20, 30 times because you're Superman. And so here he is, he's learning how to control all these powers, super strength, super speed. He can see X-ray vision, all these things. And as he's growing up, he's learning these moments. He's learning these things. And I remember as he learned his strength, as he was trying to figure out how to harness and his strength powers, he wanted to play football really bad. And his father said, I can't let you play football because if you play, you might hurt somebody unknowingly, even if it wasn't on purpose. You see, that's kind of what it's like when we start to grab these fruits of the Spirit with gentleness and all these other things that we're talking about. It's how do we use these things under the power that empowers those around us? That it doesn't hurt people, doesn't take people, doesn't tear them down, but in reality builds them up to another level. Jesus chose to make it about her rather than himself. Yes, he was telling her, I have living water, but I want to give it to you. I want to empower you with this living water for what you need. We know what it's like to be around gentleness. I think that as we've experienced real people that have gentleness, there's something in a room when you walk into them. But there's also a point when you know there's a fake near you, right? I mean, you can tell when a fake person, when somebody that's faking gentleness, it's almost there, but it's not quite. See, I like to think about it like the cubic zirconia of diamonds, right? You have the real thing, you have the real diamond, and if guys are, if you're getting engaged and you want to marry, I was not about to buy my wife a fake diamond when I proposed to her. I wasn't going to do that. I couldn't tell the difference necessarily because I'm not trained. I'm not specialized in these things. I'm not around them all the time. But see, the amazing thing is the more that these professionals are around the real thing, they can start spotting the fake, the knockoff. This is why God calls us to sit in moments with him. That's why God calls us to be in the community of believers, to be a part of groups, of mentorships, of these places where we can experience what the real thing is, so when we get around the fake, we can spot it like that. That we can see in the moment that that's fake and that's real. There was a professor at my college, my freshman year. His name was Dr. Charles Fash, and he was gentleness to a T. I guess to a G, right? Gentleness to a G. So he was gentleness through and through. And every time he spoke to you, every time he spent time in your life, you knew he was bringing you something to empower you. And one of the students shared he wasn't from the community and he had no idea. The first time he visited the campus was his first day on the campus. And so he came on school and he said, I was walking from my class to the dorm, and Dr. Fash was walking to his car, and he stopped. And he walked over to me on the very first day of class and spoke to me. And he said, I have never had anyone speak to me like that in my entire life. Not once. Never has anybody spoke to me in a way that I felt like everything that was these walls, that there was guards up for being in a new place, fell immediately. They fell down and they just dropped. And he said, I literally was speaking to him for just a few moments, and the next thing I knew, I was walking with him to his car and going to dinner with his family. It's this moment, he said, that all of the walls, all the things that I had built up in my life faded away. All these doors and these things that I wanted there because I needed to protect myself from being vulnerable were dropped down because this man, this person, brought gentleness in a way that I've never experienced before. You see, he walked past you and you could see something different. I believe as humans, we crave these moments of vulnerability. I believe we crave these moments where we can be vulnerable with somebody, when we can break down our walls and even for a little bit show who we really are, to show the brokenness and the hurt and the pain that we struggle through, to show these moments that I need something better, I need something different. He shared that he did not know how deeply his soul had been craving gentleness. Because see, gentleness invites us into a vulnerable space we want to go to. I believe as humans, for myself, I am looking for places where I can be vulnerable. Looking for spaces where I can share who I am, share my brokenness and hurt, and know that gentleness, somebody that's gentle in spirit, will come in and sit with me, even for a moment. What happens when we enter into vulnerability? It's not always the easiest. I was talking to a friend of mine this week, and I was sharing with her about this message, and we were kind of talking back and forth, and I talked about this idea of gentleness inviting us into a space of vulnerability, and she said, do not ever say that word to me, vulnerable. I hate being vulnerable. I hate those moments, but I crave them so bad. She says, I crave them because there's these moments I'm building up myself, and all I want is for somebody to see who I really am and to allow me to be who I am back. I believe this is a need of ours, and in those moments that Jesus will break down our walls, we get to be that with him, vulnerable. To open up and be vulnerable with him is imperative for our survival. The amazing thing is that when you start to live in the fruit of the Spirit of gentleness, you get to walk and bring this to someone in need. Jesus said in Matthew 11, 20 through 30, come to me, all who are weary and carry burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and the burden I give is light. You see, I believe gentleness is the oxygen to a soul in need. I believe each one of us crave that so much. We need somebody to walk into our lives and provide gentleness. And there are people here today that all you want is somebody to provide that space to be gentle with you, so you can be vulnerable, so you can breathe again. Some people have been running and running and running and trying to find a moment to rest. I don't know what you're running from. I don't know what you're running with. I don't know what you're carrying on your back. I don't know what's in that 50-pound pack on your back. Maybe it's the burdens of finances. Maybe it's the burden of family. Maybe it's the burden of relationships. I don't know what you're carrying today, but we know here at Restore that we want to create a place and a space for you to feel vulnerable and to be vulnerable and to allow gentleness to come in and minister to you today.
Thank you for listening to the Restore Church podcast. We are a church for the rest of us. We hope that God will use this to connect you with Jesus, kick you out of your comfort zone, and propel you to impact your community. If Restore has been helpful in your journey with Jesus, we ask you to consider investing in Restore by giving online at restoremtown.com. With your support, we will continue to restore Marshalltown in Central Iowa.